Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for tuning in to another of our virtual events. And we're always delighted to have Sandra Brown with us in person or virtually. And today she's going to be talking about her brand new book, Out of Nowhere. And we will be getting signed copies of the book, I think sometime maybe next week. And I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. And if you have questions for Sandra, go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, Sandra. It's so good to see you. So we're doing an actual preview event because there she is, right. We're having a little connectivity issue there for the heat. But anyway, this is a preview event because Out of Nowhere doesn't publish until next Tuesday. So that's why we won't have books till next week. But it's really always a treat to talk to Sandra. I like it better when she's here, but here we are. And we don't have connectivity issues, right? So I have to say, Sandra, that this is a pretty gutsy book. We can't really talk about one of the most interesting features because it's the conclusion, and it would be, just rotten spoilers. But I do think that you've tackled some tough topics here. What got you interested in the setup for Out of Nowhere?
I really did. I took a leap of faith because this story kept pressuring me to tell it, but it was almost like, do I want to really go there? Do I want to go spark me to do it is that it wasn't so much about, it's about a mass shooting. Right. And it wasn't so much about the event, as it was about how in the world does someone pick up their life after they've experienced this, even tangentially, but especially as involved as my hero and my heroine were. And the connection, which I don't want to talk about too much, but the intrinsic connection that occurred as a consequence of this, and two different people from two different worlds are then bound. And how in the world do you even get up in the morning? I don't know. I don't know that I could after an event like this, but they courageously began to try and cope psychologically and emotionally. And then in a very, what I think is courage. I don't know that I would have had it. But this is why I told the story, is that it's not so much about the event itself, but about how people strive to recover from something like this. So it's a very emotional book. The challenge to me as a writer was to take it, they can't just sit in group therapy for 450 pages. I had to create the suspense element. And that's what I did. As you've read it, and we can't talk about it too much without giving too much away, but how to incorporate the emotional book, the emotional story, and the turmoil that they suffered with the clear and present danger that created the suspense element. So long answer to your.
No, it's a great answer. Unfortunately, public shootings are becoming like everyday stories. I find that the school shooting ones are really hard to read. And there were, if you remember, Jodi Picoult wrote one, Laurie King wrote one, a number of them. You have set yours at a Texas county fair, where there obviously is a mix of kids and grown-ups. But what I think that really underlines the fact there's nowhere that's safe at this point. you know?
Absolutely. And while I was writing this, while I had even, I think, even gotten the idea and had started playing with the idea, do I really, as I said, do I really want to go there? But because we're so saturated with it every day, as you said, it's almost a daily occurrence, but we cannot become inured to that. And I think it was during the Uvalde, Texas school shooting
Mhm.
that for 10 days, 2 weeks, um, all of the survivors and the families of the victims were on the news nightly, especially locally here. And I thought that they're really focusing on these folk, which was amazing, which was great and wonderful because we felt their pain. But on the other hand, the very next day or the very next week, there was another occurrence, and it shifted the emphasis off of them onto someone else. And I was thinking about not just the victims who succumbed, but about the people who had to live after them and live with this for the rest of their lives, and how you recuperate from that kind of traumatic event. And so that's where I wanted to go with the story, was what happens to these people after? How did they begin to pick up the rest of their lives? And so that's what I really wanted the book to focus on. And because I don't know that any of us really can identify with the pain of that, and how you would cope with the anger, first of all, and out of nowhere, the first reaction that we get from our hero Calder, who was actually wounded. His first reaction is the anger. I want to get the son of a bitch. I mean, it was that kind of thing, a very male reaction. Elle's reaction was more a different emotion. It was about seeking justice. And then they came together, and her anger, his anger, their desire for justice and a reconciliation, a closure on this. And as long as there was any ambiguity at all, they were determined to get closure on this. And that's what made them the hero and the heroine.
Right.
As I said, I don't think I would have had that kind of courage or wherewithal at that point if I'd experienced what they did. And then to pick up the pieces, scoop up themselves and say, we're gonna do this. And as she says later in the book, if you let this consume you for the rest of your life, you just as well have died that day. In other words, you cannot let this shooter succeed in ending your life, whether you stop breathing or not. You have to pick up and go on. And I really don't know how they did it, but I hope I had the words to convey that they felt like our lives could have ended that day. They didn't. And if we allow that to happen, if we allow our lives to end, then the shooter has succeeded.
Right. Well, they suffered different kinds of losses. And I think that, that makes it very personal, but also very different. And the other thing is that the shooter is not caught at the scene. So, that makes a big difference too, because so many of these shootings end up with the shooter either committing suicide or he's shot or arrested or whatever. So having one that brings off a shooting and then escapes and is still on the loose, that's where the danger comes from, that and the motive isn't clear. So why did this person decide to do this act, and what was the motive behind it, and could it happen again? So I think that, all of that's playing out. Several books that I've read that have had a mass shooting or targeted shooting as the big act are leading up to it. They're not moving away from it. They are leading up to it. And there's always sort of that question of, could it be prevented? Could have been held, could have been headed off or something. But that isn't how your story is structured. It starts with the shooting and then moves on rather than starting and moving towards the shooting. We're in an age of such horrific crimes. I mean, you read about the Ukraine every day and you just want to weep. And the violence of that, of the mercenaries and the Wagner group and the war crimes, it's like the Nazis have returned. I did Brad Thor's book launch on Tuesday night, and we talked about that quite a lot, that Russia's basically using the Nazi playbook, so that's horrendous. And then we have all around us, we have so much anger and violence, and we have kind of an addiction to anger. So your characters are interesting in that while they're angry, they're also, moving in a positive direction. They're not just angry.
Well, I think they both, they start out kind of, as I said, with different emotions for
Right.
different reasons, and but they unite. And my another challenge as a storyteller was, as I said, they couldn't sit in group therapy for 450 pages and just rehash what the reader already knew. There had to be an ongoing pursuit, and so I wanted to. How do you? How in the context of this event do two people, fall in love, and how does that emotional overspill contribute to the suspense of the story, and how do you incorporate a suspense when they're going through this emotional turmoil? So it was a challenging book to write, but I think the people who have read it have said, oh my gosh, I was riveted from the first page. I was kind of afraid, honestly and truthfully, that people say, oh, it's about a mass shooting. I hear that every night on the news. I don't want to read it. But it could have been any event. You know what I'm saying? As you've cited, it could have been any event. And the survivor's guilt, especially on Calder's behalf. There's one line in the book that I actually heard this piece of dialogue in my head when I was only a couple of chapters into it. And I was getting a sense of his character. He was so cocky, so arrogant, and he had the world by a string. And then out of nowhere comes this event in his life that changes everything, and he will never be the same. And I love that character arc. I love what he realized about himself. And I heard this line of dialogue where he says, I have this issue with anger. I have this issue with failure.
Mm-hmm.
And Elle says, kind of scoffingly, when have you ever failed at anything? And he said, never, until it counted. And this is his struggle, that he thought he had it all figured out. And then this happens to him, and all of a sudden he has nothing figured out. His career, his love life, his, everything. And so I love that character arc that he made. And mind, I don't create these people. they come to me and say, tell my story, and they won't leave me alone until I do. But I really, at first, he's not a very likable character, but you want to know what happens to him. And I liked his, but also Elle, because she had this kind of sheltered life, a very quiet existence as a children's book writer, of all things. How innocent could that possibly be? And then suddenly she's thrust into this arena of media, but based on a violent act, something so completely foreign to her, and she steps out of her comfort zone. She's called to step out of her comfort zone to get justice for what happened to her. And so I liked these characters. That they were a whole lot more courageous than I am. I thought they did a great job of seizing the duty that they felt they had, not only to themselves but to the rest of the world, to get justice for what had happened. That takes a lot of guts. And I don't know that either of them felt they had it in them. Calder would have been the person that was too selfish to do that before. And Elle would have probably been too timid. I like my little house. I like my place.
This is an interesting version of same thing I've talked to other authors about recently, which is called folie à deux, which basically means two people together wind up doing things that singly they wouldn't have done. Usually it's bad things, it's like serial killing or, other terrible stuff. But in this case, the two of them together are stronger than each one of them would have been individually. Yeah. So it is kind of the good, the obverse, but the good side of folie à deux. But the other thing that's essential for your story to work, I mean, terrible things happen to people all the time. There have been so many like awful car wrecks, or, they could have been caught, with in any number of situations. But what's required for your story is intentionality. If it had just been like an act of God, that had occurred, it would have been traumatic and there would have been so many things. But it's the intentionality that, gives you the engine for them to work out, why did this happen? Who's responsible?
That's very interesting because the prologue, not giving anything away here, readers, in the prologue, we're in the head of the shooter. And someone who has read the book said that was the eeriest thing. Nothing happens. You don't see the individual doing anything, but it's the mindset that was so scary.
Yeah,
it was
they catch me, right?
Yeah. If they catch me, which they won't, but this is what they'll say about me. And I thought that, and when I sent in my first draft to my editor, I said, I've written these kind of inserts in the first person, in the voice, in the head of the shooter. But I don't know if I want to incorporate them into the story. But you read them, and my editor said, "Oh, it makes it far scarier to see, and also the evolution of the shooter's thinking, and throughout the rest of the book." And so I was really glad in hindsight that I went ahead and wrote those, and that they were available, and that I had placed them at key plot points in the book, because then what the killer was, what the shooter was doing and saying, then motivated the, unknowingly, unwittingly maybe, but the main characters to act. And it gave absolutely no sympathy really to this individual. I mean, so I thought it was important, to, after I talked to my editor about it, I said, yeah, I didn't know if it would be just too creepy. But no, I think it worked to motivate the characters and to involve the reader inside the head of this individual.
Well, you make it very clear at the outset that this is not some, insane person looking for, media fame or whatever it is. The person keeps reiterating that the person is sane, that the person is waiting for the right opportunity, that the person is really angry, but we have no idea why the person is so angry. And I think to the degree that this book leads up to the shooting, you do get it off to that kind of a start. And then, that's just why I stay constantly prepared. I'm vigilant. At the drop of a hat, I'll be ready. When the time is right, I'll know it and I'll do it. And the best part is no one will suspect me. So already, this is not going to be, some guy on the subway with a, with a gun. It's going to be bigger. So that kind of leads you towards this bigger theater of the county fair. Rather than a small, like a doctor's office, or, so many of these shootings take place in very small environments. But if this person is going to remain both anonymous and on the loose, you need a larger theater so that, that can happen. I've never been to a Texas county fair. We have one here in Phoenix. We have an affair. So are you a habitué of county fairs?
No, no. But I was trying to think of, a venue like that, where it would be very innocent and seemingly, an evening out for families and that kind of thing, where, I don't know if I want to talk about this too much, but a venue where a lot of damage could be done in a very short period of time.
Right.
So that's all I want to say on that.
Okay. That works. I've read other, you write, I read. I read, loads of books where a setting like this, historicals, contemporary, whatever, very often is a place where a child gets lost. It can be because in that kind of situation, it's easy for a child to slip away. So, any kind of a crowd, a large venue with a crowd, is a place where people are having a good time, but it's also possible for unfortunate, not necessarily intentional, but unfortunate things to happen. And so I think it's also, we think of county fairs and we think of,
all the gaudy stuff,
right.
The Ferris wheels and the merry-go-round and the, all of that is and cotton candy and
exactly. Totally unsuitable food. I know.
Right.
Rob and I once timed a trip to Munich because when we went to the Frankfurt Book Fair every year, we would travel around it, and we timed it for Oktoberfest in Munich, which is kind of like the Oktoberfest. And it reminded me, when I was a child growing up in Chicago, we had a big park called Riverview that we went to, and it was, full of roller coasters and all, but it had a midway. And the midway was always fun because that's where you got to, do the games of chance. You had the weight guesser, and you got to throw balls to win, like stuffed rabbits and all the rest of it. And, I don't know whether younger people are ever going to have those same memories, because that's kind of an artifact of the past, a lot like the circus. I mean, I remember going to the Ringling Brother Barnum and Bailey Circus in Chicago when I was probably like 7 years old. And, you know, you had all the wire, you had the animals, and that doesn't really happen anymore. You know, there's a lot.
Well, I wanted it to be, as you're saying, it's you're portraying all the things that were fun and memories and that kind of Americana before we had this plague of terror in our society. And and I remember all those events too, you know, and I grieve for, you know, my grandchildren, that they won't know that absence of fear, you know, that kind of hangs over all of us now.
Absolutely true. The 4th of July. I mean, you know, we haven't gone to any of the big local celebrations for the last couple of years. This year, my brother invited us to go to the country club, Paradise Valley Country Club. We thought, well, you know, that'll be good. You know, they'll, I mean, you have to hope there's no deranged golfer that's about to take it out on the club because they shot 100 or something. But, you know, but I mean, there's the big public events don't feel safe anymore. And it used to be that was a time for communities to get together. I mean, we used to get on the village green in Winnetka and we would have, you know, races and there'd be fireworks and there'd be all this kind of stuff. I'm not sure that anybody even feels particularly safe sponsoring something like that anymore because of the potential for, you know.
But we can't let that stop. We can't let that stop because then we're giving into, you know, I just don't think we can live our lives in constant fear, but it's a very, you know, it's a very pressing threat. And, but
it's all about risk assessment. You know, you have to decide whether the pleasure or the joy or the experience is going to outweigh any potential risk. So it's a calculus, I'm afraid, that we all make now. And, you know, I hate driving around town and seeing schools that are now, you know, behind.
I know.
You know,
they're like centuries.
Yeah. And you're reluctant to, you know, lend a helping hand to people if you see them in trouble because you don't know what weird things are going to happen. So I think it tends to silo us, you know, in our own individual lives and to be less community minded than we currently are. But, you know, maybe it'll pass. We have a national addiction to anger at the moment that is making it very, very difficult. And I kind of hope things go in cycles and maybe, I mean, I'm a child of the McCarthy era. So I remember, you know, the whole blacklist and how scary a time that was and how divided a time it was. I was in junior high school and high school through the McCarthy era. And, you know, even then in schools, it was a little bit scary. And then it, you know, died out and there was more cohesion. And then we got, you know, the Vietnam War protests. And I go, so there are cycles in society that bring anger and fear to the fore and then tend to fade away again. So I can only hope that
can only hope. That's right.
Yeah, that, you know, this will go here. So I think your title for this is really brilliant because out of nowhere certainly describes what happens, doesn't it?
Yes. It was interesting. I always play with titles and I was trying to think of a good one for this. And I was talking to my editor, remember the moment exactly. And I was saying, you know, it's just these two people. We were talking about the plot in the book and the characters. And I said, and I think I was talking about specifically Calder, the hero. And I said, you know, he had everything in the world going from him. And then just out of nowhere. And I went, that's my title. And my editor said, that's so funny because he said, I was doodling on this last night and I was thinking about possible titles And he said, that was one I wrote down. I said, there you go. We've got our title. But yeah, the concept of out of nowhere is disconcerting, to all of us. We rock along and we may be having a great day, or we may be having a terrible day. It can also be just the opposite of what Calder and Elle were experiencing. They were each having a great day.
Right.
But it could also be you're having a terrible day, and then something out of nowhere, even more terrible happens. And you're thinking, why was I worried about that? Why was I worried about that minimal problem? That was an inconvenience. This is a catastrophe. There's a big difference between the two of those. And someone was talking to me about the book earlier today, and they said, do you think that their realization after the event, after the shooting event, that they came to appreciate, the small things, the things that we take so for granted? I said, well, how could you not? Yeah. Even in my life, in your life, in everyone's life, there have become, really break stops where we thought, oh my gosh, I thought yesterday was bad. I thought yesterday was bad because I missed an appointment or because I had a flat tire or something, but this is really bad. And you learn to distinguish. And for a little while, you think, okay, I'm going to live, like the Tim McGraw song says, live like you were dying. So embrace every moment, appreciate every moment, be grateful for every moment. And then it fades away until something else like that happens, but I think it's a wake-up call, to distinguish the difference between an inconvenience and a catastrophic event, something that realigns your priorities really quickly. And that's what happened in this book, especially for Calder. Elle, I think, was a little more level, and she had a very placid life, and she's called upon to do things she would have never considered in her wheelhouse. That she would have been it would have been impossible for her to do. So I commended these two characters for the way they stepped up. They had a whole lot more courage than I would have had.
Well, sometimes, we have an inner hero that never has a chance to come out. There's never a call for it. And we don't know if it's there until, the opportunity.
Until you need it. Right.
Yep. There's stories of people, lifting cars one-handed off children,
right.
And
yeah.
all other kinds of stuff. Adrenaline is an astonishing drug. So, I mean, many people go through their whole lives and are never tested, and, lucky for them. But other people, and, I learned long ago something really catastrophic happened to me when I was 41, and it was the right age because I know now that only at that age are you actually physically able to survive what actually happened. And I still remember lying there in a hospital bed, and this was in a Bible Belt part of the country where I no longer live, I might add. And people would come in and, because there was no hospital security, so random people would stroll in, and many of them would say, "What did you do to deserve this?" And that I'm serious, because there was always this idea. There was an idea among so many of them that something terrible could not happen to you unless you had invited it, unless you deserved it. And, from that, I evolved a philosophy that, bad things just happen. It doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person or, whatever, the universe, things happen. And you have to find out, if it happens to you, what you're made of. But I think too many people assign character to events. If you're a bad person, then bad things will happen to you or something. But that's not really true.
No, I don't believe that at all. bad things happen.
They do, they really do. And you can't control them. That's the other thing, is you can't lead a life that is premised on staving off bad things happening to you, because they're so random that, whatever you've been doing to try to protect yourself from it really doesn't work.
Yeah,
Wow.
we can't.
So
I think we can live in fear.
Yeah, I counted up and it looked to me like this is your 29th book. Does that sound right to you?
Uh,
I have a whole page here. While she was talking, I counted. This is the whole page of Sandra's books, right?
Well, those are all of,
but not all of them, huh?
Those are all of, actually, Out of Nowhere is my 85th.
Oh my God. All right. So what's missing from this roster here?
All of the romances that I wrote before I started writing mysteries and thrillers, I had written about just under 50 romances under 4 different names. And so I wasn't discovered by anyone who read outside the romance genre until about maybe, oh gosh, sounds so long ago, it was long ago, about 1988. And I wrote my first standalone book called Slow Heat in Heaven.
Okay, that's the bottom of the list here. So
the next 2 books were published in paperback. Mirror Image made the New York Times bestseller list, and that was my first New York Times bestseller. And since then, I've written about 30, 35 books. So, officially, Out of Nowhere is my 85th. And one of my paperback romances that was published, I think in like 83, 84, came on the New York Times bestseller list this summer, a reprint of it. And that was my 75th New York Times bestseller. Because, of course, when I wrote it, when it was published, I hadn't made the New York Times list yet. So the title, that title was my 75th.
So what
it seems incredible to me.
Well, it certainly is a tribute in many respects. What jogged you from romance over into a darker, more thriller-esque?
Well, I had, after 45, 48, whatever the number was, romances, I felt like I'd kind of peaked in that area, in that particular genre. And they were great books to learn from. And I don't ever feel like I left that genre. I feel like I brought everything I learned into it. For one thing, they were a limited page count. So you had to get into the action immediately. You couldn't piddle around, with a lot of stuff. You had to get right into the character, right into their problem. You had to solve their problem quickly. An economy of words, write it trim, because you've got a lot of ground to cover in a short space. But always when I was writing them, I was wanting to elbow my way out of the parameters of the genre at the time. Now, keep in mind, this goes back a long time. Now, anybody can write anything. But at that point in time, we had very specific topics that we could not write about, very specific things that we could not say. The language had to be, kind of eased back. And so I wanted to move out of the parameters. And I was always giving my editors heart attacks because I would come up with these plots that they'd say, "Oh God, Sandra, you can't do that." And I'd be like, "Well, you kind of can. You can, And so I was constantly pushing it. And when I wrote Slow Heat in Heaven, that was the first time they said you can do anything you want to do. And then everybody was kind of like, she used to be such a nice girl. What happened? But it was a step forward. And from there, I started incorporating more and more mystery, more and more suspense. And so I had a great education in self-taught, but in writing all of those books before I ever moved into what I'm doing now. And they were, they were great practice. And yet each of them was just as hard. No book is ever easy. You have to compel a reader with your characters and with the predicament that they're in and solve the problem. And that's not easy. And the 85th book, Out of Nowhere, was harder to write than any I've ever written. And number 86 will be harder than it, because I never feel like I'm quite there. That this is a learning curve. I've still got a lot to learn about producing a book that readers want to read and find it entertaining and compelling and engaging, where they say, I read till 4:30 in the morning because I couldn't put it down. And that's not an easy point to get to, because I read too. I'm a reader too. So I know how hard it is.
What did you do before you began writing romances? Did you just, did you do any sort of?
I was on television. Yeah. I worked for the ABC affiliate in Dallas, and I did local weather sometimes. I worked on a show. It was a magazine show called PM Magazine. It was a syndicated program, and I was a contributor, local contributor. Did these little like two or 3 minute segments, and it was a part-time job. I'd go in and record 3 or 4 or 5 of them in a day. And I had 2 babies at home at the time. But when I got fired from that, I still had 2 babies at home. And I thought, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And all of my contemporaries were, were members of this club or that club or this club and I just thought, this is not me. I've got to have some kind of, thing that's mine, some creative outlet. So I started writing fiction. My father was an editorial writer and for the newspaper, and my mother was a romantic who loved stories, who loved books. Books had always been my favorite toy. From the time I could read. I mean, I'd read all the time and I read everything. I read adult fiction as well as Nancy Drew and, the Hardy Boys. But I read everything. And so I was preparing myself, I think. Daddy had to produce 500 words a day, and he went to work every day and did that. So the work ethic was instilled in me. And then my mother's love of stories and storytelling and books. I mean, she had me reading Jane Eyre when I was like 12 years old, maybe. So I was a mesh of those two. And when I started writing, it was like, all the lights came on. And it was like, this is what I was intended to do with my life.
So getting fired was actually a plus, it was one of those.
Oh, it was devastating at the time. I mean, it was heartbroken. It wasn't anything that I did wrong. No. They just came through and said, we want fresh faces. And so, and it was crushing, but in hindsight, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So sometimes it's like, these, what seems like a terrible thing is really the biggest blessing of your life, which it was in my case.
Out of nowhere, right?
Out of nowhere.
Indeed, it was. So you mentioned book 86. I always like to ask before we move to audience questions. There will be a book coming up for you when? Next year?
About this time, probably. I was sitting here one day. I've been renovating a house for a year, and it's just finished. Do you like my new study?
I do. It's beautiful.
I have been working on that a lot. And so one day I was banished up here. It's upstairs. It's the only room that's upstairs. And I was banished up here because there were painters, carpet layers, everybody on the ground floor, and I couldn't walk anywhere without getting in somebody's way. So I came up here and I was sitting here. I thought, well, I could read a book for pleasure, because Out of Nowhere was in production. I mean, it was done. And I thought, gosh, but this is a whole afternoon that I will wish I had next April when I have to deliver a book. I wish I would have used it. And so I just came over here to the keyboard and I sat down and started writing a scene. And I have no idea what the plot of this book is going to be, but I have two characters, I have a scene, and by the end of the day, I had 13 pages. And it was just like, it's such a compulsion, Barbara. I can't tell you. It's just such a compulsion to tell a story. And I don't always know. And these 13 pages may end up in the trash, but I've got an idea now. I've got a place to start, and got two characters that I think could be interesting. She's kind of a shapeshifter, you know. I think we won't quite know what she's up to. So that's a beginning, and I'll see what it turns out to be, and it may be nothing. But
well, it'll be something. You know,
I can't not write.
Right. I get that. Right. And also, you know, you move around. I mean, you've done historical, you've done, you know, you're not every book is, you know, a world building exercise with you. You have, you know, you start and
from scratch.
You know, it's interesting, you know, talking to people who write series and then talking to people who write standalones and the pluses and minuses of both of them. But, you know, a lot of it, I think, depends on how comfortable you are with world building is really what it comes down to. You know, a series, you start
I like that phrase. I've never heard that phrase before, but thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, with the series, you know, you start out with, and you've got a sort of a basic architecture, and as the series goes on, you keep, you know, adding to it or subtracting from it or doing whatever. But when you're writing your kinds of stories, you know, it's a new world every single time. Everybody in it can be at risk. A reader doesn't have a safety net thinking, okay, you know,
I've got to show up the next
will survive. Yeah. So, you know, I think it's great that there are so many different kinds of storytellers, because as a reader, you know, as well as I do, that, you know, you're not always in the mood for a particular book. I think all readers are surrounded by multiple books, because you never know for sure what you want to dip into according to what
that certainly is a frequently asked question, is who do you read? What do you read?
Right.
And I say, I read everything. I read everything, whatever the mood, you know, however the mood strikes me. I'll read a hot romance one week. I'll read about a serial killer the next week. I'll read a sweet romance one week. I'll read a Eric Larson nonfiction book. My only requirement is tell me a story. Tell me a story that is going to captivate me. And I don't care if it takes place, you know, in a spaceship or a wagon train. If it's a compelling story with characters that I care about. And that's what I try to give to my readers. I try to tell a story about people that I don't know, but that I wish I knew. You know, the worst advice I think you can give to a fiction writer is, well, write what you know. Well, when somebody told me that, I started looking around, and nobody I knew was very interesting. I was like, I don't want to write about him or her. I mean, they're boring. So I started writing about people that I wish I knew. And that's what I hope I leave my characters. Gosh, that'd be an interesting person to have lunch with, and that's that, because I have to live with them for a year. So they've got to be interesting to me. They've got to be compelling to me, and their story has to be compelling to me, because I'm a pretty good, as you read all the time, I'm a pretty good barometer of my own work, because if I'm getting sleepy at the computer, if I'm getting bored, then something's got to happen. It's got to happen soon. And so if I'm writing a suspense scene and my palms are sweaty, that kind of means I know what's going to happen, and it's suspenseful. If I'm writing a love scene, my heart better be pitter pattering, so I get viscerally, emotionally involved in my stories. And if I'm not, then if I know it's not working, it's not going to be working. If it's not working for me, if I don't get teary eyed, or if I don't laugh out loud, then that line of dialogue is not going to resonate with the reader either.
So you're a person who, while eating a sandwich alone, is never alone, right? Because
I have imaginary people living in my head all the time.
So Patrick, come and join us. I think that we might want to see if there are any questions from the audience before we come to the end of our hour.
I like the quote. I don't care if it's in a spaceship or a wagon train. That's a great quote.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Tracy says, hi, Sandra. How did your publisher transition you from straight romance to more mainstream suspense? She's asking about the marketing and the book covers. Do you feel most of your romance readers followed you over to the dark side?
I do think they did. I may have lost a few along the way, but I think because if you read the early romances, you still hear my voice as an author. I can pick up one and open it up, and I don't remember writing it at all. I may remember a little bit of the plot, but I probably wouldn't remember the character names. But when I start reading it, I thought, yeah, this sounds like me, even though it was a completely different genre. In terms of the publishing, I was kind of issued a challenge when I said, well, I'd like to start writing more mystery and suspense. And it was like, well, if we market you that way, then you maybe shouldn't be writing category romances. So I had to take a leap of faith. It had to be a career decision, and it was difficult. I'm looking at you, Patrick, not up here. Sorry. But it was a taking a leap of faith. And the first thing I did was after Slow Heat and Evan, and after I think it was Best Kept Secrets, then there were bosoms and biceps on the covers. And I said, okay, if you're gonna start marketing me as more of a suspense writer, then we can't have bosoms and biceps. And so Mirror Image had a completely different cover. And that was my kind of cover. And that was my first New York Times bestseller list. So I kind of won that argument. And so from then, and not that I have anything against bosoms or biceps, but it was just that the marketing had to change if I was going to change.
Now, when you were doing romances,
thank you, Tracy, for the question.
Yeah, when you were doing romances, did you kind of experiment with all the different subcategories within that genre?
Oh, absolutely. As far as they would let me, as far as I was allowed. As I said to Barbara, there were certain strictures that, we couldn't get past if we were writing for a bona fide category romance. And so I would come up with plots and they go, you can't do, and the classic story about this is when I wrote the Texas trilogy. I had an idea for writing, it was two brothers and a sister, but I told my editor, I said, I want to write the first two books from the male point of view because they're thinking great things. Now, keep in mind, this is before that header. And she said, well, you can't really do that in romance. And I said, well, you really can't. You can. And so I wrote Texas Lucky and Texas Chase from their point of view. And I said, but if it makes you uncomfortable, make you feel better, I'll throw in a kid sister and the third book will be from her point of view. So that's what I did. And the last time I checked, they were in their 45th printing in the United States. So they resonated with the readers, and that's the main thing, is to resonate with the readers. But I was always kind of wanting to, move beyond the boundaries, pushing the envelope a little bit. And some of my plots were iffy. I had to convince an editor, say, look, I know that the proposal for this sounds like it's going to be absolutely scandalous, but you've just got to trust me to handle it with kid gloves. And they did, but they were always a little on the borderline.
That argument is true. It's not the category you write in crime, but the cozy crimes. I remember trying to convince a publisher that you could have a cozy crime written by a man. And they said, no, that the parameters of the cozies were, that they must be written by women and must be amateur sleuths and must, whatever. But if you've noticed, fairly recently, there have been a number of men who have entered into the cozy thing, a couple of them under pen names, but more and more so. And then they've taken on much more diversity. So, they're not as heterodox as they once were.
Well, I have reader, in when I'm speaking, inevitably someone will ask the question, you write most of your books now from the male point of view. How do you know how a man thinks? And I go, well, did anyone ever ask Anne Rice how a vampire thinks? If so, we need to be, cautious. How did Peter Benchley know how Jaw thought? And books have been written from the point of view of werewolves and monsters and aliens. And does anybody ask those authors?
Are you comparing men to vampires and sharks?
No, sorry, but you get my point.
Comparison.
It's imagination.
Half the great books wouldn't exist, if people followed that kind of
exactly,
logic, right?
Exactly. That I don't think George or Martin thought too terribly hard about writing from the point of view of all the characters that he created. So it's. But yeah, I love them. I love writing from both points of view, actually. But I don't think that one's genders should restrict them in any genre.
Yeah, each book should be judged by its own merits, don't you think? Did the author pull it off is the question.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Let's see here. Okay, Fred would like to know, how long of a break do you take when you complete a novel? Do you have any kind of ritual or celebration that marks the end of a book?
Oh gosh, I'll probably have an extra martini on that day.
You smoke your one cigarette of the year, and then...
No, not like in Misery, but I take a little time off. I take a little time off. I don't think that a writer ever stops working because as soon as I finish a book, there is a lot then of publicity to do and preparation for the publication of that book, and that takes up a lot of time. And but also my mind is already kind of laid those characters, aside. I've completed their story. I don't stop thinking about them, but I'm on to what am I going to write about next? And I can take usually about maybe 6 weeks off, and then I start getting antsy. And as I told Barbara earlier, even on an afternoon off, when I was like going to pick up a book to read for leisure, I thought, I want to go over to the keyboard and just see what happens. So it's so compulsive that I don't take a great deal of time off. And then sometimes it takes 2 or 3 months just to plot, the book before I ever start committing it to paper. And sometimes I just start writing and I never have a plot in mind. I just see where it goes. So it's, I don't think writers ever truly shut down.
No, I think it's a story addiction.
Yeah, it is.
I really like that. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite part of the process? Do you like doing the first draft, or do you like the rewriting process? What do you have a favorite, or is it just the whole thing?
Getting the check.
Getting
No, I'm being facetious. But my favorite process, the torturous one, the really torturous one, is getting the first draft, because I have this fear of waking up in the morning and it being discovered that the first 85 books have been total flukes, that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'll never be able to do this again, that I'll never be able to come up with another story or create an interesting character. And so getting that first draft, getting the story out. My favorite part of the process is going back and starting on page 1, word 1, and rewriting it, massaging every single. I rewrite a whole lot longer than I write. Just getting it, milking it for all it's worth. I've got it there, but just writing it until it's as good as I can get it. Every single scene has to count for something, and it has to be a pivotal point in the book. So I work on those scenes for days before I let them go and move on to the next one. So, but that's the process I really love. It's because the material's there. I've just got to make it good as I can make it.
That's probably really good for people to hear, that somebody at your caliber and at your level and experience still suffers from imposter syndrome at times.
Oh my God. Well, every morning, every day. It's like, I'm going to be found out. I'm going to be found out. Yeah, it's, I have to scale a wall of fear every day.
So do you have any advice for, aspiring writers?
I think it would be in question form. I think it would be, how hard do you want to work? And what are you willing to give up to do it? That would be, I think, putting it in the form of those two questions, because I don't think anyone realizes how hard the work is, physically, emotionally, everything about your person is involved in telling that story and telling it well, and as well as you can do it. And at the end of the day, I feel like I've been beat with a chain. I mean, I'm exhausted. And I think that people have a misconception of, you write when you're inspired, or if you don't feel like writing that day, you don't do it. We think about Hemingway. I have a picture on the wall over there of a picture that he took of a lion with a zebra that the lion had killed, and it was addressed to his guide and signed by him and dated. treasure of mine. Well, we see that Hemingway, God, what a glamorous life, and today I put on earrings, makeup, the whole bit. This is not it. This is not the real. This is it's grunt work every day. We don't know how hard it took Hemingway to become Hemingway. And I think that it's the work that people don't understand how hard it is, and what you do give up. You give up lunch with your friends, you give up weekends, you give up Saturday afternoons to work. So I would ask them that.
What's your average writing day like? Is there such a thing? Do you keep a regular schedule, or?
Yeah, not as rigid as I used to be when I had children and, at home, and had school, and I had to be the mom too. Still have to be the mom. But I'm not an early riser. I get up late, and I usually pill around till about noon, just doing emails and maybe having a telephone call or two with a friend or family member, busy work. And then I hunker down. My heart starts beating at about noon, and then I write for 5 hours, 5 solid hours maybe is a good day. And then but then that's on a normal work day. When I go away, when I'm in that final draft, which usually comes in January, right after the holidays, I shut down my life. No social, no appointments, no speaking engagements. And I go away, and it's pajamas for 3 weeks. And I write for 8 or 10 hours a day, because that's the final draft, and I'm making it as good as I can make it. So those days are different than other days. I don't have any outside, interference, as little as possible.
Maybe one final question that's come in from YouTube, which is, would you ever consider doing a book along the lines of I'm not familiar with this, but the Gilgo Beach murders, possibly from the victim sides? Is that something, are you familiar with that? The Gilgo
I am. Yeah, it's up in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Is it? I think.
It's Long Island. I think it's the whole Long Island.
Okay, I knew it was a beach area. I couldn't remember. But that's certainly been in the news. I don't know. From a victim standpoint, I don't know if I would want to live a whole year, which I do with each book. I don't know that I would want to live a whole year with something like that. But
sorry, my puppy is driving me crazy, and I took the screen so you can see what's going on here. I can't pick him up because I've had hand surgery, and he is doing it. You can see it's absolutely dramatic. I know.
My light's falling.
All right,
down.
Scooter, here you go. You can show off how pretty you are. See, there you are. Yeah. All right. He just wanted to be part of the action there for a moment. Yes, you did. Right. Sorry, he's a scene stealer. Yes. Right. Any other questions, Patrick? I didn't mean to distract everybody.
No, not at all. Let's see. There are a few more. Does each book get more difficult to write because of using up material? In other words, is it more of a challenge to keep it fresh?
Oh, I think it is. And it's also competitive, and not just with my colleagues and everybody else who's writing fiction or captivating nonfiction, but it's also with myself. I think you're only as good as your last book. But yet, I know I've written books that were far better than others. And usually that kind of depends on what was going on in my life at the time. But because I do have a life other than this, and but I think it is harder each book is a challenge. But for that reason, to whomever asked that question, it's a good question, because to try and keep it fresh, with each book, I try and build in some element that I've never done before. Try a new technique, do something just a little bit different than anything I've ever done before. And that way, it's a challenge to me. It's a new learning experience, a new, writing technique that I've never tried before. So that's a very good question, because I do build in a challenge for myself in the hope of preventing anything from getting predictable or routine, or as though I phoned it in. I would hate to hear that critique from anybody that, well, she's just writing them now just to fulfill her contract or whatever, because I really do try my best to pour my heart and soul into it.
Or that you've done it before yourself. This is stuff, something I've already done. Anna was the one who answered or asked the question, which was very good. All right, one more. I don't know if you can reveal this, but what were some of the authors' names that you wrote under when doing romances? Can you reveal any of those?
Oh, yeah. I wrote under my children's names, were my first 5 books. The pen name was Rachel Ryan, and that was a bribe to get them to leave me alone.
Rachel and Ryan?
And let me write, and I would put their name on every page of the book, and their name would be on the cover. So that was my first. Rachel Ryan was my first 5 books. Then I wrote under Erin St. Clair, and then I wrote under Laura Jordan. And then by now I'm like 8 years into that career. And I was beginning to think, as I explained to Barbara, wanting to move, into standalone. And that's when I started writing under Sandra Brown. So there were a lot of romances written under Sandra Brown, but I wanted it to be under my own name and build that name so that if and when I had the opportunity to make that move, I would already be established.
Right. You'd have a fan base that you could take with you. Yeah. That was very smart. You've obviously been very intelligent about your career. I mean, you love
sometimes.
I don't think, you could not possibly have published 85 books and been so successful if you had just winged it all the way through.
Well, I would like to think, for one thing, I never talked about my business with any publisher, with another publisher. I learned discretion very, very early, but also I think anybody I ever parted ways with, I think I parted ways with on speaking terms, and it was always a business decision, not a personal decision. And I've worked with amazing people. I've been inordinately blessed to work with greats in the business, and I've been grateful for that.
Well, on that note, let us say that Out of Nowhere will be publishing next Tuesday, August 1st. And our autographed copies from Sandra, somewhere lurking in her house probably, or about to be, will be coming to us next week. And so it should be clear to you from this conversation, you don't have to have read any book by Sandra Brown or her other names. Out of Nowhere, because it is a universe complete unto itself. It's a very surprising book, and my only regret is that some of the most interesting things about it we can't discuss.
We couldn't talk about.
I know, I really wanted to, but is this the sort of thing where you wish you could? Maybe we should do it sometime. You could go back and have like a book club, that 6 months later, and then you could really discuss some of the features.
Well, there is a book club reader guide on my website, and available from Hachette from Grand Central Publishing. So there is a book club reader guide And it does have some very as you can imagine from this book, particularly some very thought-provoking questions.
Absolutely true. I mean, I think if we take probably at the moment, our greatest fears about, violence and things happening to us in situations beyond our control, in gatherings where we don't expect it. And then how, as Sandra has said, so forcefully, how do we survive that? How do you get past the trauma? Do you let it destroy your entire life? And if you don't, how do you manage it? And in this case, it's two people together who help each other move forward. But it's not just them. There are people around them and associated with them. So, it's not just the two of them. It's sort of dragging a lot of people forward and not letting the perp, as we say in our slang, not letting the perp win. Which is a good idea. This puppy is going to win if I don't. He is going to claw me to death. So I forgot to feed them before we started. It was a really bad decision. Yeah. So I'm going to say good night, everybody, and go and feed my pups. And thank you so much for joining us. And Sandra, we won't be with you on publication day, but let me wish you a very happy and successful.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, everyone who was listening.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.